Deconstructing the will and the user illusion. To make a distinction between empirical will and phenomenal will, Wegener presents four basic conditions of human action. The first demonstrates the expected correspondence of action and the feeling of doing. We do something while feeling that we are willing ourselves to do it. This is the normal or the assumed and natural exercise of human volition. The opposite situation is also non-controversial, when we are not doing anything and feel that we are not. The third case includes automisms, such as alien hand syndrome and hypnosis. Wegener says hypnotic involuntariness thus provides an example of the lack of experience of will that is even more perplexing than alien hand syndrome. With alien hand, the person simply does not know what the hand will do. But with hypnosis, conscious will is lacking even when knowledge of the action is present. The final and fourth case Wegener calls the illusion of control. This is where people have the feeling they are doing something when they actually aren't. Examples include when we don't know whether our push of an elevator button or a Coke machine selection lever has done anything, yet sense that it has. Or when we feel we have contributed to the outcome of a sporting event on TV just by our presence in the room. Brackets. Did I just jinx them by running off to the fridge? Close brackets. David Rose deconstructs self-awareness. He says, quote, "The traditional view is that introspection is direct and infallible. It seems intuitively obvious that we know how we feel. Descartes insisted the one thing he could be sure of was that he was thinking. Later, this was seen as applying more to our experience of emotional and other subjective states, such as being in pain or experiencing a certain emotion. However, even this aspect of the accuracy of introspection has been questioned in modern times. A psychoanalyst, for example, might well claim that a person can be in a particular emotional state, say anger, without being consciously aware of it. And when it comes to representations of, for example, external objects, the infallibility of introspection has become, in modern thought, even more dubious. Our everyday representations of the world do not in any direct way resemble what modern science tells us about the world outside, i.e., that it is composed only of chemicals, electromagnetic radiation, and so on. Rose concludes that the infallibility of introspection, quote, "We can have illusions and delusions about ourselves, and we do not know our own mental states perfectly. We don't know our own motives. In some cases, we are mistaken even about the state of our own bodies. For example, anorexics think they are fatter than they really are. We know from neurophysiology that there's a long chain of pre-conscious processing before conscious awareness. Introspection can't gain access to these processes, end quote. In Deconstructing the Embodiment and Ownership of the Self, Susan Blackmore takes the extreme position of flatly denying that she has any self at all. She identifies two extreme positions. The first sees the self as a psychological point at the center of one's consciousness. The opposite extreme is to identify the self with the whole brain or whole body. The problem with this is that we really do see the self as something different and separate from our brains and bodies. Blackmore then contrasts two major kinds of theory of the self. Firstly, what might be called real self theories. They treat the self as a persistent entity that lasts a lifetime, is separate from the brain and from the world around, has memories and beliefs, initiate actions, experiences the world, and makes decisions. On the other hand, are what might be called illusory self theories. They liken the self to a bundle of thoughts, sensations, and experiences tied together by a common history. Blackmore says, quote, "The illusion of continuity and separateness is provided by a story the brain tells or a fantasy it weaves." She concludes that everyday experience, ordinary speech, and common sense are all in favor of the real self, while logic and evidence and more disciplined experience are on the side of the illusory self, end quote. Blackmore asks, quote, "So what does myself do? Surely it must at least be the center of my awareness, the thing that receives impressions as I go about my life." Not necessarily. Conscious sensory impressions can be induced by stimulating the brain, but only when it is consciously stimulated for about half a second. This would lead to the odd idea that our conscious appreciation of the world lags behind events, end quote. According to Libet's work, quote, "The readiness potential began about 550 milliseconds, just over half a second before the action, and the decision to act about 200 milliseconds, about 1/5 of a second before the action. In other words, the decision to act was not the starting point. My brain does not need me. The implication is that consciousness does not direct the action. The hand is removed from the flame before we consciously feel the pain. We have whacked the tennis ball back before we can be conscious of it coming towards us." End quote. In true functionalist style, Dennett sees a narratively constructed self as completely independent of the brain and body out of which it was initially devised and maintained. In fact, Dennett sees the program of the self as being so independent and separable from its biological hardware that he speculates that it might even survive death in another medium. He says, quote, "If you think of yourself as the center of narrative gravity, on the other hand, your existence depends on the persistence of that narrative, which could theoretically survive indefinitely many switches of medium and be stored indefinitely as sheer information. If what you are is that organization of information that has structured your body's control system, or if what you are is the program that runs on your brain's computer, then you could in principle survive the death of your body as intact as a program can survive the destruction of the computer on which it was created and first run." End quote. Blackmore suggests a meme theory of the self. Quote, "Memes can gain advantage by becoming associated with a person's self-conception. It does not matter how they do this, whether by raising strong emotions, by being especially compatible with memes already in place, or by providing a sense of power or attractiveness. They will fare better than other memes. By acquiring the status of a personal belief, a meme gets a big advantage. Ideas that can get inside a self, that is, become my ideas or my opinions, are winners. Beliefs, opinions, possessions, and personal preferences all booster the idea that there is a believer or owner behind them. The more you take sides, get involved, argue your case, protect your possessions, and have strong opinions, the more you strengthen the false idea that there is not only a person, body and brain, talking, but an inner self with esoteric things called beliefs. The self is a great protector of memes, and the more complex the mimetic society in which a person lives, the more memes there are fighting to get inside the protection of the self." End quote. The Danish science writer Tor Nordstranders supports the useful illusion view of the self, which he calls the user illusion. This, he says, is, quote, "one's very own map of oneself and one's possibilities of intervening in the world. As the British biologist Richard Dawkins puts it, perhaps consciousness arises when the brain's simulation of the world becomes so complex that it must include a model of itself. The user illusion operates with a user by the name of I. The I experiences that it is the I that acts, senses, and thinks. But it isn't. By analogy with a computer, Nordstranders argues that the brain and body contain lots of information that the I is not interested in. As he says, quote, "The I can't be bothered to know how the heart pumps the blood around me. Nor can the I be bothered to know how an association occurs in me. It is not only the I experienced as our personal identity and objective subject that is an illusion. End quote.